Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Hope you're doing well today. As you know, we were discussing electoral systems, and we understand an electoral system as the system of laws that regulates how votes are cast and how votes are translated into seats. And we've mainly been talking about majoritarian forms of electoral systems or first past the post forms, those forms that relate to winner take all and non-proportional ways of translating votes into seats. The last one that we talked about was ranked choice. Today, we're going to continue talking about majoritarian electoral systems. And the objective today is to illustrate and evaluate some of these different types of systems. So we'll look at some examples of ranked choice ballots, and then we'll eventually talk about some other forms of majoritarian system. I'm going to involve you as much as possible, and so I'll have questions for you, and we'll be doing a variety of exercises that involve you interacting with and answering questions about different ballot designs. So the objective today is for us to really think about and evaluate some of the pros and cons of different majoritarian electoral systems by thinking through the ballots and the systems for ourselves. This is an example of a ranked choice ballot. This is an Australian how to vote card from the 2004 legislative elections. And this is the Liberal Party. Basically, what they did here is they gave the voters an example of the order or the list of preferences, the rankings that they should inscribe onto the ballot. And you can see that they even go down to the level of telling the voter that if they make a mistake, they should ask for a new ballot paper. But first and foremost, they tell the voter that the Liberal Party candidate should be ranked first. And after that, there should be a specific sequence of rankings that the voter writes down on the ballot. This is for the House of Representatives, and this gives you a good sense of what a ranked choice ballot would look like and how it might look and how it might be different than, say, a single non-transferable vote. If you went to Fiji in 2001 and looked at the ballot for legislative elections, it would look like this. And it was also an example of a ranked choice ballot, just very, very different from the vantage point of the individual parties, the party labels, but again, a ranked choice ballot. Now, there's a lot of debate in the United States about the potential value of a ranked choice system and how it might change US elections, specifically by changing the incentives faced by parties and by voters. This video is going to discuss this debate. And the reason I like this video so much is because it puts the different trade-offs in perspective. It talks about how the change might affect the individual parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party. It talks about how voters might vote differently. And in the process, it really does a good job of discussing the ways that institutions generally affect the distribution of power, the incentives faced by different actors, and how different institutions structure politics differently. So sometimes it's difficult for us to escape our perspective. Obviously, we have first past the post single member districts. we vote once when we cast a vote in a legislative election for the House of Representatives or the Senate. Ranked choice voting would be very different. And in the process, it would change the incentives faced by parties and by voters. So let's put that in perspective and give ourselves a chance to think about how the electoral system as a set of institutions shapes those different incentives.
Washington is totally broken.
Washington is broken.
Washington right now is broken.
Nothing will get done in Washington this year because Washington is broken.
For years now, politicians have been telling the American public that they can't deliver their campaign promises because of the gridlock in Washington. But with so much at stake, from healthcare to education to Social Security, it seems there is more than just ideological differences standing in the way of social progress. At times, it seems like the whole system is set up to fail. But two researchers are claiming that the industry that spent $6.5 billion in 2016 and $5.73 billion in 2018 is flourishing.
The parties, the political industrial complex, which works very well together in one particular way, and that is to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves jointly from new competition. Politics isn't broken, it's fixed.
A movement has been growing across the country to change how the system works. Places like Maine, San Francisco, and Santa Fe are changing the way their representatives are chosen to allow voters to rank their preferences instead of choosing only one representative. Initial surveys of ranked choice voting in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Cambridge show voters are more satisfied with the conduct of local campaigns than in similar cities with plurality, winner takes all, voting. Could ranked choice voting save Washington? In 2002, the late Senator John McCain campaigned to support instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting.
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for Ballot Measure 1 on August 27th. Ballot Measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters.
And that same year, then Senator Barack Obama introduced SB 1789 that would have created instant runoff voting for Congress and state primaries, as well as authorized it for local elections. Ranked choice voting is an alternative way for citizens to vote for who they would like to represent them in office.
You pick your favorite, just like always. But then if you want, you can also say, this is my second choice, my third choice, my fourth choice, and my least favorite choice. The polls close. And now all the first place votes are counted. And if that candidate has a true majority, meaning over 50%, well, the election's over and that candidate wins. But if after the first place votes are counted, none of the five has over 50%, then the candidate that is in last place is automatically eliminated from the race, and voters who had selected that candidate first now have their second place votes counted instead. We rerun the totals, and you continue on that process until the election produces a true majority winner, meaning we're always going to elect the candidate with the broadest appeal to the most number of voters.
You could vote for me as your number one, knowing that you could vote for Hillary Clinton or whoever your safety is as your number two.
Researchers Catherine Gale and Michael Porter claim Democratic and Republican candidates have no incentive to work towards societal greater good because they're beholden to the party more than their constituents. Instead, they argue, the parties are operating in a duopoly, prohibiting independent candidates from achieving success, creating a formula that rotates different figureheads and limits opportunities for innovation.
A duopoly is an industry where there are two dominant competitors. And in the politics industry, we of course have the Democrats and the Republicans as our two dominant rivals.
Think of Coke and Pepsi as mentioned in a recent Freakonomics podcast episode. It's in their best interest for Dr. Pepper never to gain the notoriety of the other two soda brands.
The Democrats and Republicans, they are a combined duopoly. I mean, they dominate this space. There's a reason why people like Mike Bloomberg, Howard Schultz, whoever else you can name that's considered running as an independent has not run. Oh, you can call it unfair, but that's just the way our political system, that's what it's turned into now.
You're looking for a perfect process.
That's not what democracy is. And if you're looking for everyone to come out a winner, that's also not what democracy is. It's not Junior League T-ball where everybody gets a prize. There are winners and losers. And how you vote shapes who wins and who loses.
In today's climate, there's incentives for people to be partisan, and every single move is being tracked. Every word they say from the time, even before they announce a president, is being tracked, recorded, monitored. It's impossible to try and subtly change your way halfway through a campaign. You're going to get called out on it.
And many of these call-outs are done by members of the candidates' own parties.
The vice president has still failed to acknowledge that it was wrong to take the position that he took at that time.
If you want to do well running for office in a ranked choice voting election, and you want supporters of other candidates to rank you as their second choice, and there's an incentive to be a little nicer to those candidates and maybe not attack them.
The idea that somehow elections are going to get less rancorous, that's just not going to happen. We are in a state in this country where people have fundamental disagreements about very important issues. That's not going to change just because you change the way candidates are chosen in the voting process.
Ranked choice voting is compelling for a number of reasons. I think in today's politics, its most compelling is to just allow us to have more than two choices, to allow new players to sort of enter the marketplace of ideas and to be considered and evaluated and voted upon for what they're saying and what they're offering, rather than the sort of the horse race partisan impact of what they might mean for splitting votes and so on.
The third party candidate ultimately just siphons off votes. A third party candidate ultimately undermines the nominee of a particular party. And in this case, if it's the Green Party running a third party candidacy, it will have the same impact that it did in 2016, or when Al Gore ran and Ralph Nader was the spoiler in that race. A third party candidacy is a spoiler.
I want to see an alternative political party. These two political parties are telling millions of Americans they have nowhere to go. And people don't like choices like Tweedledum, Tweedledee.
If you have more choices and more opportunity for new players to get in the arena, that can ultimately create better products for consumers. And I think that's the same basic dynamic in politics.
Gale and Porter argue that candidates and elected officials may be able to get bipartisan laws passed, but there is no reward for not supporting the party, because if you vote against the party line, you won't receive their support in the next election. Ranked choice voting would change that, because voters can be more or less supportive of elected officials based on their actions, not just their policies and positions.
If you solve anything in a bipartisan way, you likely won't make it back through your primary.
Not a lot of crap. I hear that argument from so many Democrats and Republicans that they say they're getting burned at home because they're working across the aisle. They're not working across the aisle, they're posturing. Right? I've never seen a politician lose an election because they built a bipartisan coalition and accomplished something. I think they do lose credibility when they show themselves to be hypocrites.
And in a political climate where there's no reward for coming in second, the party's support can make or break a candidate.
Imagine a market where you as an emerging business could only make your first dollar when you were the biggest company in that market, right? So that you can't grow. Like if you start off at 10%, you're making nothing. 20%, you're still making nothing. 30%, you're making nothing. Finally get up to 40% or whatever it is, and you can actually make all the money, right? Or something like that, right? But it's like really hard. So the market is very duopolistic that way.
When you look behind the scenes, we find that Democrats and Republicans work very well together in one particular way, and that is to cooperate, some would say collude, to set rules and practices that protect the industry from themselves, that protect themselves jointly from new competition.
That's one of the reasons Maine chose to adopt ranked choice voting.
Then you have the state of Maine, which is for us a thrilling story. It's a state that has advanced ranked choice voting first at the local level. Then they have moved in, they used it for congressional elections and all their primaries in 2018, and now they've adopted it for president.
Maine, as you know, last year, so the 2018 election, had the first federal election ever, a congressional race, using the ranked choice voting system. that race shows why ranked choice voting is not a good idea. The candidate who got the largest number of votes, the largest plurality in the first round of tabulations, did not actually win the race. And because there were multiple rounds of tabulation, apparently thousands of ballots cast by voters were thrown out.
However, supporters of the process claim it gives more power to the voters by making votes for third-party candidates count when the tally moves to an instant runoff. Think of the duopoly example of Coke and Pepsi. Just because a voter prefers Dr. Pepper, it doesn't mean that he or she doesn't want soda at all. This change in the process challenges the duopoly of the two parties and reforms the industry. Opponents argue that this requires too much of the voter.
You talk to the average voter about this, and I think the average voter has the same feelings that former California Governor Jerry Brown has. They find ranked choice voting confusing and overcomplicated.
Virtually without exception. It's been a very positive, supportive reaction from voters saying, I liked this better than what I did before. The very strongest support is from people under 40 who are not sort of used to a single choice ballot. They're like, of course this is better to be able to rank rather than vote for one.
According to an exit poll conducted by the Bangor Daily News in Maine, over 74% of people said ranking choices was either somewhat easy or very easy. In the US, it's been used in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Santa Fe, with 5 new cities using it in November 2019.
And then the fact that you can't get elected for president next year without winning or competing for electoral votes in Maine, and you won't be elected for president without learning something about ranked choice voting because you have to win in Maine.
Other countries, like Australia and Ireland, use a version of ranked choice voting. And while some claim the process favors progressive ideals, the Conservative Prime Minister Scott Morrison won re-election in Australia.
All of these rules, practices, and norms have been created outside of the Constitution, and therefore the good news is that as dysfunctional as so much of this politics industry is, it's invented, and we, the citizens, can force changes in that invention.
Okay, so my question for you is, would ranked choice voting change US elections? And how would it change them if it did? How would ranked choice voting change US elections? Karen says more candidates would run for elections. So why would more candidates run, Karen? Louis says it might increase participation. So why would it do that? Jake says, I think we would see more support for candidates that may not just be considered the safe option. Louis says, since people will believe their candidate's party will have a chance. Okay, so why will more candidates run for elections, and why might third parties in particular be more successful in elections? Efren says ranked choice would impact candidates who are favored in second place. In the video, it mentions that second place candidates are brushed off to the side, and therefore the voting change will benefit candidates who are secondly viewed best. Nina says it gives the voters more leeway in voting because it is a rank of multiple candidates rather than a choice between two candidates. Uriel says there would obviously be more options to choose from, but I also think that it might allow for a smaller party to get in the way of one of the two larger parties from winning. For example, if a socialist party got in the way of the Democrats from winning and allowing a right-wing party to win. But Uriel, do you dispute the logic of the model though? But wouldn't a socialist party in that case win because it had the broadest support as indicated by preferences expressed in second, third, fourth, or fifth rounds? Jocelyn says maybe it would make people feel like their vote matters more because people would already be thinking of their second or third option if their first doesn't get the majority. It feels more inclusive too. So for these reasons, because people have more choices, they might be more likely to vote, right? They might go to the polls in larger numbers if they feel satisfied or more involved or included in the process. Oscar says the big parties would have to compete with more political parties, which they might focus on keeping their promises to continue winning elections. My question for you is, do political parties and do candidates face an incentive to be nicer to other candidates and other parties? Do they have an incentive to try to reach out to voters across the aisle or to appeal to a broader range of voters? And if they have that incentive, does that make our process, or does that make elections more democratic? Does that make the results more democratic? Are we more satisfied if parties have to behave in a way that might cater to a larger share of the population? How does it change the incentives faced by parties? For example, do you think that we would have more polarization or less polarization if we had ranked choice voting? Think carefully about this. Would we have more polarization or less polarization? Uriel says it is definitely more democratic, but I'm unsure if the results would please the voters. Okay. So Max says we would have less polarization. Why is that? Why do we have less potential for gridlock, or why do we have less tension between parties or candidates if we have ranked choice voting? What is it about that change that would lead to less polarization? Jeffrey says, I would say no, since it will cause more gridlock in Congress. Is that true though? Why would it affect how many bills would be able to be passed? Max says candidates and parties would have to adopt more moderate platforms. Right, Max? Because they would need to appeal to a larger audience, right? Because if people have 5, 6, 7 votes instead of just one, and if 5, 6, 7 rounds of preferences will determine the election, well, suddenly you've got to appeal to really everyone, right? You've got to appeal to the largest possible group of voters you possibly can, because they will all take some position on you, so to speak, when they express their preference order. And so it gives parties and politicians and candidates more of an incentive to moderate their position. Justin says, I think less polarization because the spread of votes will be more equally distributed, perhaps. Maybe. I don't know if ranked choice guarantees a more equitable spread. I think that we should expect third parties and smaller parties to get more seats. And in that regard, it might be more proportional, certainly. I don't know, though, if, as Jeffrey says, inevitably gridlock results, right? I think that might have more to do with the number of cleavages. You, for example, might have 3 or 4 parties and not 12. And if you have 3 or 4, that's not necessarily prohibitive as far as coalition formation is concerned. And so it does get a little complicated. Uriel says it just gets rid of a binary way of thinking about politics. So what does that mean in practice, though, right? If we're getting past the binary way of thinking, does that mean that parties have to begin to think in a more nuanced way? Does that mean that they have to develop a policy agenda that appeals to or represents a larger set of the electorate? Does that mean that candidates go and speak to more voters than they otherwise would? Karen says, I think there would be less polarization because there would be more candidates to vote for. However, Americans have very low political participation and knowledge level, so it is possible that it can increase polarization. But maybe ranked choice increases participation. Max says, I disagree, platforms and agendas to even get elected. I'm not sure, Max, what you mean. Kiana says less because there are more options to choose from rather than the usual 2 options. Other parties will also have a better chance. And so if voters have more options, remember, though, that they have those options presumably under a plurality winner-take-all system where we have 1 vote too, right? It's not that they have more options, it's that, well, they do have more options. They have more votes, right? They have more preferences that they can express, and they have more choices, so to speak. But really what matters is that we have subsequent rounds in multiple rounds of potential vote counting. And it's that change and that inclusion of subsequent rounds and the need for the victor to win a majority that means that third parties have a better chance, an easier way in, right? Michael says it would increase voter turnout since there's more options and people would feel their vote has more weight to it. So all of these things have been observed. There typically is higher voter turnout. Typically third parties have more representation. Typically large parties have to moderate their positions. And typically voters as well are more satisfied with the elections as well. And so democratic elections can be run in a variety of ways. One of the majoritarian forms of electoral system is a ranked choice system. A ranked choice system does involve more choice and can produce better outcomes if what we care about is participation, if what we care about is moderating the extremes that appear on the boundaries of party systems and electoral systems, and if what we care about is ultimately representing a wider spectrum of interests. But you'll notice that in the video, there were very, very strong positions taken by the representatives of the Republican and Democratic parties. There's no coincidence there, right? They're the beneficiaries of a plurality first past the post system, because that system does penalize third parties and does present the big parties with an incentive to run to the left and run to the right. And although I don't think that the extent to which the parties have run to either side is equal, it is true that the plurality system has tended to amplify the extremes. Now, let's continue discussing these majoritarian systems, because there are a lot of different forms that majoritarianism can take. Majoritarianism is far more internally complex than proportionalism. And as you saw on Monday, majoritarian electoral systems form a larger proportion of the systems in the world than do proportional systems. In fact, about 50% of the systems are majoritarian in some form or another. Another form of majoritarian system is the two-round system. Now, a two-round system has the potential for 2 rounds of elections. And the way this works is candidates or parties are automatically elected in the first round if they get a certain share of the votes, usually an absolute majority. If no candidate or party wins an absolute majority or crosses the threshold, they do a runoff. And there are 2 types of runoff in 2 types of 2-round system. There is a majority runoff 2-round system, and there is a majority plurality 2-round system. Now, when you look at this example, the French legislative elections of 2007, you notice that we have 2 rounds of elections. France legislative elections are an example of 2-round systems. Who won these elections? Tell me in the chat. So Mariton won the election. But notice that Gregoire, the other candidate in the second round, obviously comes in with a larger share of the vote than they did in the first round. But there's the possibility that Gregoire wins this second round, despite not winning the first round. And so a critic of this system might say, well, you can end up with the winner of the election that didn't actually win the first round. And a critic might say, that's an undemocratic outcome if the winner of a plurality in the first round is denied election because they did not win the majority in the first round and subsequently lost the second round to the candidate who got a smaller share of the vote in that first round. Now, those who would argue that the 2-round system is more democratic would say that it does come down to choice, and it comes down to giving voters a second look after the first round of elections comes to an end and all of these different candidates have been sorted through. Of course, if you're Mariton and you lose the second round despite winning the first round, you would argue that that feels undemocratic. Where you stand depends on where you sit. A 2-round system is one more way of doing a majoritarian electoral system. It's not like what we have in the United States. It is what they have in France, and it's another way of counting votes and translating votes into seats. As with all systems, there are advantages and disadvantages. And what we're going to do is begin to think about those advantages and disadvantages for each system. This is what we'll do for the rest of today, and we'll do this on Friday as well. As we introduce these systems, we're going to be thinking about the pros and the cons for voters and the pros and the cons with regard to how the system affects the behavior of parties. So parties and voters are two sets of actors we're going to be thinking a lot about. So a two-round system obviously has the advantage that it gives each voter a second choice. You get to go to the polls a second time after seeing the results of the first election. In addition, the two-round system encourages bargains between parties because when you eventually declare a victor after the second round, there's a space in between where the parties have an opportunity to work together to reach some sort of an agreement or a bargain or a negotiation. So even if a party wins the election, maybe they cooperate with another party, or maybe they reach some sort of an agreement that's reflected in the behavior of the winning party. This also tends to reduce vote splitting. The disadvantages include that the second race is often very costly to run, and usually it has lower turnout. So sometimes it's hard to get people to come out in as large a numbers as they did in the first election. Georgia has a runoff system for their Senate races. If no candidate wins a majority in the first round, it goes to a second race. And so you'll remember that the November elections did not produce a majority for either race. And so both Senate races in Georgia went to a runoff. And those runoffs took place in February, excuse me. Notably, in Georgia, those runoff races did not have lower turnout, or substantially lower turnout, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of new voters were registered in the interim. Part of that had to do with the fact that it was a very, very consequential race. It was in a unique election. But generally speaking, two-round systems can have the disadvantage of registering lower turnout and being costly to run when it comes to those second races. Another form of majoritarian electoral system is the single non-transferable vote. And the way this works is voters cast a single candidate-centered vote in a multi-member district, and posts are filled by the candidates with the most votes. So if you have a 3-seat constituency, voters vote for a single candidate, but the 3 candidates who receive the largest numbers of votes win seats. And for example, in Japan until 1996, if you went to the polls, you had a single vote, but multi-member districts meant that each district elected multiple candidates. And so the top vote getters would get seats in those districts. The UK also has multi-member districts, or at least in this example, you can imagine voting for a single choice, and as a result, voting once, but multiple districts would mean that, say, if you voted for Clegg, and Clegg won, but Cameron also got the second highest total, both would get a seat, even though you also only voted for Clegg. So a single non-transferable vote system has the advantage that it can result in better minority representation. Because whenever you have multiple seats, you're creating more opportunities for underrepresented parties to find a way in. Remember that when we talked about single member districts, one of the drawbacks was that those tended to penalize smaller parties. They tended to also penalize minorities. Another advantage of a single non-transferable vote is that the more members there are in the district, the more proportional the results can be. Meaning, with more members in the district, the better results you get from the vantage point of reflecting the actual desires of the electorate. Voters get to choose among candidates as opposed to parties, which means that they're choosing directly rather than empowering party leaders to make the choice about who will represent the party. And it's also easy to count the votes. The disadvantages include, for example, that there's a need for voters to disperse the vote among the party's candidates. If voters aren't disciplined in this way, there might not be as much sort of minority representation as you could achieve. Candidates compete within parties as well, which can sometimes undermine parties themselves. There's a risk of clientelism and bribery where candidates directly link themselves to voters and in an effort to try to win the race. And there's no guarantee of proportionality. No, Jeffrey, these are still majoritarian electoral systems, but majoritarian systems are not created equal with regard to how proportional or disproportional they are. So what that means is some are even more majoritarian than others in terms of the votes they waste, so to speak, or the extent to which they hand the constituency to a single winner. A block vote is another form of electoral system that's also candidate centered. And the way this works is voters have as many votes as there are candidates to be elected in that district. There are multiple members elected in the district. The candidates with the most votes win. And so Kuwait, Lebanon, and Syria all use this system. And the way it works is if you have 3 candidates or office holders, you have 3 votes. If you have 5 candidates or office holders, you have 5 votes, and so on and so forth. And based upon however many candidates or office holders there are, voters vote. And as a result, you get election results that anoint office holders. And the advantage of this is that voters can choose individuals and that this encourages coherent parties. Because parties face an incentive to try to coordinate their individual candidates so that parties get as many of their candidates elected as possible. If parties aren't internally coherent, you won't be able to elect multiple members of that party in that district. One of the disadvantages of this, though, is that there's potential disproportionality if voters don't disperse their vote across parties. With all of these majoritarian systems, there's always the risk of disproportionality. With multiple members, there is the potential for a more proportional spread of the vote across parties, but that relies on the discipline and the behavior of voters. It's possible that those voters will vote entirely for a single party. So when you look at this, How many members are in this district? Tell me in a private message, how many candidates or members are in this district? It's 3. Voters have 3 votes. There's also what's called the party block vote, and this is used in multi-member districts. Voters cast one party-centered vote for their party of choice, and the party with the most seats wins, most votes wins all of the district seats. And Djibouti, Singapore, and Cameroon are all examples of this. This is a ballot from Singapore. You vote once, and the party with the most votes gets all the seats. The party leadership then decides which members of the party will fill the seats won by the party. And so this gives extraordinary power and influence to the party leadership. The advantages of this model is that it's very simple. It does encourage strong parties, and it can facilitate minority representation. But it can also be very, very problematic because voters don't vote for individuals. Yet, when you're voting for just a party, you're giving the party leadership control over the composition of the seats and the portion of the legislature to be filled by the party after the results of the election. And this can lead to a great deal of corruption. And in particular, it can lead to stealing and theft of state resources by party stalwarts who are basically under the influence of party leadership, who dangle seats in front of them in exchange for stealing from the state in positions as bureaucrats and in other roles. The party leadership benefits a great deal then from the party block vote, even though it's still relatively simple and encourages strong parties and can facilitate minority representation. Listen, everybody, we're still only halfway through this discussion on electoral systems, and we'll continue discussing some majoritarian systems, and then we'll begin discussing proportional representation on Friday. But we're right in the middle of this thing, and we'll continue addressing these issues when we meet again on Friday. Have a great remainder of your week, and I'll see you then.